Airstrikes in Syria, climate change, Eric Holder resigns, and the latte salute. I'm James Kidd, and this is The Square Circle. And welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, James Kidd. Joining us today are Gregory Clay of gdclay.com, political consultant Marcio Coimbra, Mytheos Holt of the R Street Institute, and communications consultant Don Owens. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
This week, the U.S. launched airstrikes in Syria in the ongoing campaign against the Islamic State. President Obama addressed the United Nations, calling on other nations to assist in anti-terrorism operations. This followed the announcement that 5 Middle Eastern nations have joined the U.S. in the effort. So, Marcio Coimbra, how optimistic are you about the campaign's success?
I'm very optimistic about this campaign's success for what this purpose is. But the problem is how we got there. That's the whole problem that we have now. I mean, according to the circumstances, there is nothing else that we can do. But what worries me is the lack of policy, because last year we're going to attack Assad, and this year we're going to attack Assad opponents. So in which side are we? So I think it's a lack of leadership or a lack of policy, and I think that in the whole Middle East we should take more attention to other countries, like I've already spoken here, like in Libya and in Iraq and in the past, but now we're came to a situation where something has to be done. It's pretty sad that we have to do it, and we're gonna have to do it in Libya in the future. And if we keep making mistakes, we're gonna have to act like we're having to act now with ISIS.
Don Owens, what do you think?
I think the American people, when it comes to the situation, the bombing of ISIS, should be very troubled. And I think the administration needs to be concerned, because when people are troubled, that leads to doubt. And looking at past foreign policy, trouble and doubt leads to catastrophe. It's very easy for America to get into war and to win the war. We don't concentrate on winning the peace. We're going to have a big problem if we bomb ISIS out of existence. You still have a fundamental dispute between Sunni and Shia, which is not being addressed. What happens if we take care of ISIS, and then back in Baghdad they install another oppressive Shia leader who goes out and victimizes many of the Shia citizens in Iraq and on the border with Syria, and then we're back again dealing with what you just talked about of having to go into Libya and to Syria. So it's dominoes that keep falling. This is very troubling. And then there was an interesting story on NBC this week that we're analyzing the president's speeches. And ironically, a lot of his rhetoric sounds just like the president we've been criticizing for the last 6 years, George W. Bush. That should be troubling to every Democrat, every progressive, because we don't want to knowingly or unknowingly replicate the same playbook we criticized 6.5 years ago.
Mytheos Holt, what's your take on the situation?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good thing that the Obama administration, which has been spending so much of its time being a Bush administration reenactment, has finally gotten around to reading Gene Kirkpatrick's Dictatorships and Double Standards. At least they're reading the smart neoconservatives these days. No, look, I mean, I think we know which side we're actually on in this fight, and I think someone who probably learned lessons from the Arab Spring is giving President Obama advice now. We're on Assad's side. I mean, there was a story this week in the New York Times where clearly there are information being relayed from the Iraqi regime to Assad saying, you know, the United States can't say it publicly, but they're on your side. The Syrian ambassador loved President Obama's UN speech, except for the one small part where he's going to give weapons to rebels, which I think ISIS... I will never say this again, but I think ISIS was correct when they put out a speech recently saying that these weapons caches are going to basically be loot for them to take when they kill the moderate rebels. It's very clear to me that the Obama administration has learned that sometimes when you're dealing with a totalitarian insurgency of the kind that ISIS clearly is, you have to back the authoritarian dictator because they're the lesser of two evils. And that was effectively what Bill Buckley said Bush should have done when he tried to invade Iraq and install a new leader. And if President Obama wants to back the authoritarians, then by all means. But I think the fact that we've set such a precedent that we're supposed to be trying to make democracy sprout from someplace where it has no roots has given us a lot of trouble in Syria. And I agree with Marcio that this will happen elsewhere, and we need to be prepared to either back the strong men or have a credible alternative, and I don't think we're prepared to do either.
Gregory.
Well, we were all forewarned. We just have to look back at history. As I remember, George Bush, on July 12, 2007, I believe, made a serious warning. Please do not leave the Middle East. Then you would have total catastrophe. We've seen that. Leave behind some type of auxiliary force or something there. Go to 2012. Remember Mitt Romney? When he talked about having to deal with Syria and being involved in a conflict with Syria. And remember the Democrats ridiculed him, especially Joe Biden, in a very passionate speech. Ridiculed Mitt Romney big time. He said he wants to invade Syria. Okay. Look where we are now. Okay. The interesting thing about this is President Bush and Mitt Romney are right now looking like two serious seers or soothsayers or predictors of the future. Whether you like them or not. What George Bush said on July 12, 2007, he made like 4 major points. All 4 have come true. Same thing with Mitt Romney during the debates in 2012. Remember, he talked about Russia would be a problem. President Obama basically laughed him out the building. Said, Mr. Romney, remember the Cold War is over. And he also said we don't use muskets anymore. He was so condescending toward Mitt Romney. And he talked about Russia. He also talked about Syria. Look where we are now. So the bottom line is, to paraphrase Batman from the 60s, I remember the show well, when Alfred the Butler said, "He who laughs last, laughs best."
So do all of you support the U.S. campaign against the Islamic State in Syria, or do any of you think that it was a bad idea to begin with?
We spent $35 billion in Iraq alone just to train the police and furnishing them with equipment. And I'll make a similar point that I made the last time I was on this show. In the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, and Iran, you have some of the greatest concentrations of wealth and power in the world, just sheer money. And yet whenever there is a conflict, Sunni Shia, militarily, the first leader they look to is the United States. And I wonder, when we had this debate more than a month ago, why was there no public positioning from Saudi Arabia, who was supposed to be the leader within the kingdom? Why were they not making some attempt to stamp out the issue of ISIL in Syria and Iraq with Iran then, except they sat around and waited for the United States? It makes no sense to me to have this region with so much wealth concentrated, who consistently wait around for American soldiers, Army, Marines, Air Force to come in and solve their problems. I at least want to see a solution, a Middle East solution first, before we commit U.S. soldiers every time first.
So do you support the U.S. action in Syria right now?
I think we have to at this point. Our soldiers are on the ground. I feel in some respects like Republicans did in 2003, who were leery of invading Iraq to win the hearts and minds of people, Shia, who'd been freed for the first time in decades to practice their religious ceremony. And I remember watching, I think it was a CBS story, Shias were allowed to do some ceremony where they walked in the streets and they took rocks and cut their heads open to symbolize as they're bleeding, as sacrificing for Allah. And I remember turning to a friend and say, those folks may not be the best candidates for democracy, fresh out of the can. And my friend said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, that is just." I think democracy, you have to ease into it after you've chosen to do it. And we were basically just ripping open the bag and saying, have at it. And so I support the troops. But again, there's been no indication from the president, no indication from his advisors of what the end game is here. How does this end, except at the end of a barrel or a missile? And we've tried that in Vietnam. It doesn't really work.
But I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, and we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Moving on, another major story this week involved climate change. President Obama addressed the UN on the topic this week after massive protests calling for climate justice. But noticeably absent were China and India, two of the biggest carbon emitters whose cooperation is essential for any climate deal to work. Mytheos Holt, does the absence of China and India doom any potential deal, and is that a bad thing?
Well, it depends on which absence you're talking about, honestly. China and India not being present for a speech or not being present for UN meetings on the topic does not necessarily doom this whole business. The actual conference they're supposed to have in Paris is where we'll see all of this hammered out. But if China and India aren't partners in any sort of climate deal, then effectively this is the United States shooting itself in the foot for no good reason. China and India together made up 83% of the emissions between 2000 and 2011. They are the biggest sources of carbon emissions on the planet. Anything that tries to address carbon emissions without addressing India and China simply doesn't cut them enough to make much of a splash. The United States can't address this on our own. The United States, one of the things that has come out of this has been that several businesses have committed to try and reduce emissions. That's fine. Their customers want it. There have been some steps by India and China to try and reduce their emissions caps by 2020 or 2030 or whatever else. But if you were to reduce it by the actual amount they would need to reduce it in order for the country to go as green as the 350 protesters want, China and India would be basically stabbing their own economy and gutting it. Their economy is built on building massive amounts of coal-fired power plants and industrializing very quickly, especially China. This is not something that they're going to halt just because a few protesters sing Kumbaya. In fact, if you've seen Tiananmen Square, China especially doesn't seem to care what protesters think when it comes to their own regime's success internationally.
So the bottom line is, you have to make a choice. If you want a good economy, then you have to have bad energy, especially in China and India. I mean, that's the deal, right?
Right.
Huh. So, I mean, and those two economies are major factors globally.
Yeah.
Globally. You know, I mean, it's a very difficult situation. You know, if you ruin those two countries' economies because of emissions and etc., I mean, would the world see a global depression?
That the United States is an incredible country. We've been around this long for a reason. And generally we've been around this long because we lead. When it comes to our military, we just talked about ISIS, we lead. When it comes to health and safety standards, we lead. When it comes to the environment, however, everyone on that side of the table and partially on this side of the table wants to hit the brakes and say, we can't lead in the environment. And I also will say third thing, I'm happy that my president, unlike others in the past, is at the United Nations talking about the environment, talking about climate change, and trying to work towards a solution. Yes, India and China are a big part of the concern, and I think they can be a big part of the solution. But we can't drape our rhetoric any longer in sort of this, what I call country passing the buck. If the Indians and the Chinese won't lead, then America won't lead. I never thought I'd hear that coming out of conservatives' mouth. But I hear it year after year. If China and India won't lead, then America can't lead.
Yeah, but it's a money
thing. And that's
thing.
un-American.
It's a money thing.
Okay,
You know.
let's get Marcio on this.
I think it's a matter of the economy.
Yeah, a money thing. Exactly.
It's the economy. I mean, the economy is there, and there is one reason that China didn't hit back the U.S. during the crisis is because they need clients to buy their product.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
So
Exactly.
it's all economy,
Right.
and
money.
And money,
Right.
and the economy is there in China. I just came back from China, and what I've seen, and what they are doing. I mean, their economy is booming, and
Right.
but they really don't care about many things,
Many things,
not
right.
just about environment, but
Yeah.
some other things. But that's the way they work,
But-
and
but-
they do not submit to certain rules.
Mm.
That's how they do business.
Right.
Otherwise, they don't do business.
Right.
And in the world today, we need them as much as they need us.
Right.
Also this week, Attorney General Eric Holder announced that he will be stepping down once a replacement is named. Holder's tenure as the nation's top law enforcement officer has gotten mixed reviews. Gregory Clay, how do you characterize the Holder Justice Department?
Well, Eric Holder, I have to admit, was a very polarizing figure. Again, whether you like him or not, the dude is polarizing. His idol was Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General during his brother's administration. Mr. Holder was President Obama's front man on all things race. And it was obvious they were tight. To use a sports analogy, especially in football, Eric Holder would be Barack Obama's offensive line. He would be his guard. Mr. Obama would be the running back because Eric Holder took the flack. He was the front man. He was running interference, helping Barack Obama to carry the ball. Mr. Holder, was very outspoken about race, about race in the criminal justice system. And remember, he made that famous speech when he said that he called the United States a nation of cowards, quote unquote, because the country, he felt, did not want to have a serious debate on race and all this stuff. And in fact, I gotta say this now. I'm getting so tired of hearing people say we have to have a national conversation on race. I mean, every time something happens, you hear it over and over again. We must have a national conversation on race. We have to have a national debate on race. Whenever something happens, no, we don't. But anyway, back to Eric Holder. He, was very loyal to President Obama, because he took all that flack, because the Republicans were on his case, Eric Holder's case. But then again, Eric Holder a lot of times said things that prompted the Republicans to get on his case, especially that nation of cowards, comment. And he, went to Ferguson, of course. And the comment that he made in Ferguson that stands out the most is when he said, "We stand here with the people of Ferguson." Now, a lot of people took that as serious partisanship. The case hadn't even gone to the grand jury yet, and we don't know the outcome.
What about this side of the table? What do you guys
Well,
think?
I am glad he's going.
Yeah. I'm sure you are.
Oh yeah, I'm glad he's going.
Yes.
But I'm sad that the policy is not going to change.
Mhm.
I expected change when this government reached power, but it didn't happen any change since the Bush administration. It got worse. The surveillance, and I mean journalists saying that they cannot work in Washington anymore. This is our years that are worse than the Nixon years here to work at the press. I mean, I am glad he's gone, but I know for a fact that the policies of this government are not going to change. They're going to find another Eric Holder to attack civil liberties again. And this government was elected because the last government didn't take care of these liberties.
Okay.
And it was supposed to come to power and change it, and they made it worse.
I bet you his replacement is Deval Patrick.
He said he doesn't want it.
He said that?
Yeah.
Don, how would you characterize the Holder Justice Department?
Well, I think after 6 years, the Attorney General has done a terrific job. And based on reports I've read, he recently had a health scare. His wife is extremely happy that he's stepping down finally. He's one of the longest-serving members of the Obama cabinet. Contrary to some of the comments here, I think there's been tremendous gains in gay rights at the federal level, enacting rights for them as far as equal protection for benefits they receive at work as federal employees, counterterrorism. There's been advances there. Also in voting rights. The report came out this week that showed that for the first time in 20 years, federal prison population is at an all-time low. That's an achievement for the Attorney General, making sure that the right people are in prison and other people for low-level crimes are released. People who are high-level marijuana dealers serving federal prison sentences released under those situations. I also think the Attorney General, he was needed at a time. The last Attorney General we had, Alberto Gonzales, was responsible for essentially getting rid of habeas corpus, which is something that conservatives, well, some conservatives, not all, didn't really have an issue with 8 years ago.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I got to
We'll let them speak for themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's also difficult to be a cabinet member, and I think the issues that Eric Holder was willing to address and talk about from day one were issues that traditionally had been shied away from because they made people uncomfortable. No
Civil
one wanted
rights.
to look at it. But I will say this, I'll agree with you. It's becoming rare and rare these days.
Oh, me?
but, yes.
Gregory Clay?
I will agree with Gregory Clay on one thing. We do have to stop every time there's an incident where there might be or there is a conflict about race and saying we need to have a national discussion. The national discussions don't work. We need to have a local discussion in homes and living rooms and school cafeterias, but it doesn't need to be had from a podium in Washington, D.C. People should put out statements, express their condolences, but also, in my last point, the Attorney General expressed his condolences and solidarity with the people of Ferguson. The people of Ferguson is the entire town. It's 28,000 people in that town, not just the 20,000 African Americans who live in one community. If you look at the video clips, he was in white diners, he was in black soul food restaurants. It doesn't just mean people are out in the street marching.
Go ahead, Gregory, and then we'll get Mytheos.
Okay, my rebuttal. Okay, but the officer, did he ever mention him?
No, why would he?
Yeah, shouldn't he be seeking justice? I mean, because
He made statements to that effect.
much of this is perception. Because when Eric Holder made that comment, I stand here with the people of Ferguson.
Yes.
The perception was that he was essentially saying, "Okay, all you black folk, I'm with you. I'm
Not
with
at
y'all.
all.
I'm with y'all.
Not at all.
I'm with y'all." I disagree.
Not at all.
Look, that was the perception.
The perception would have been that way if he had stood there with the Brown family,
You know,
which he did not.
You know,
he
that
didn't stand with the
that
defendant.
was perception. Perception is reality in a lot of cases.
I don't think so.
You know, I
I
definitely think so in this case. You know, because in this case still hasn't been adjudicated. You know, suppose Officer Wilson was right. Suppose he was justified.
Okay, before we get into a whole discussion about Ferguson, let me get Mytheos to take on
Look,
the Holder
we
Justice
had this
Fund.
we had this debate the last time I was on the show, and the conclusion we seemed to reach was that when he said, "I stand with the people of Ferguson," the implication was not the cops. That's all I'm going to say on that subject. As far as Eric Holder, I think this gets to an excellent point, which is the one way I would characterize the Holder Justice Department is contemptuous of the rule of law. The Holder Justice Department, as my colleague on the right here points out, was very clearly one that was prepared to step on freedom of the press, was prepared to engage in mass surveillance and defend it at the court level. I'm relieved to hear that Don doesn't support getting rid of habeas corpus. I'm not so relieved that he thinks that freedom of the press is an acceptable price for voting rights. Even if you concede that Holder was good at voting rights, which let's talk about the other things Holder was bad on from a racial minority perspective, just from that one. Operation Fast and Furious, arming Mexican drug cartels. That's bad for brown people. Operation Choke Point, going after Native American-owned lending businesses. That's bad for minorities. And by the way, the Holder Justice Department consistently refused to answer any questions from Congress about either of those operations. In fact, it was openly held in contempt of Congress multiple times for refusing to cough up documents. Now, you can say if you want, I know you will, Darrell Issa's partisan. Darrell Issa wants to get the Obama administration. Fine. I don't care how partisan Darrell Issa is. If they have nothing to hide, then why refuse to give up the documents? If there's nothing to find, then why refuse to give them up? They are, in fact, being paid by the people, and refusing to listen to Congress, even when Congress is partisan, is pretty clearly a thumb in the eye of the balance of power. The Holder administration is symbolic of everything wrong with, or the Holder Justice Department is symbolic of everything wrong with the Obama administration, and its racial myopia, its complete inability to engage with the other side in any sort of constructive way, and its contempt for the institutions of American balance of power and rule of law. And as far as the Holder administration, and as far as Holder's replacement goes, look, the fact that Al Sharpton is being asked to consult on who the replacement is going to be,
No.
the man who called
No.
Jews diamond merchants.
That is not true.
Yeah,
No.
I feel safe.
Someone is they're consulting.
No, he is. No,
No.
there's been stories to this effect.
No.
Sharpton has said, I'm being called in to consult on who the replacement is.
You believe him? That's the next question. Do you believe Al?
Do you believe it?
No, hell no. You know, and also speaking of Eric Holder, didn't he sue the state of Alabama over voting rights?
He sued,
He sued a lot of
sued
people.
multiple states.
Yeah,
Over
This
voting
whole-
rights.
this whole-
Pennsylvania.
the whole basic thing about IDs and all that.
Yeah, the voter ID laws.
Yeah, exactly. But which I just have trouble with that because, I mean, so many people saying, well, you can just go and just vote, and Republicans. That's one thing I agree with Republicans on. What's wrong with having an ID to vote? I mean, if I get on Amtrak, what do I need to get on the train? On the Amtrak train, okay? Or if they won't let me on, what is it called? An ID. Since I don't have a car, I have a walking ID from the DMV department in Georgetown, here in Washington.
Okay,
Okay.
but what is wrong with,
Yeah. What-
reporting the news? And isn't that wrong to get into journalists' emails?
Yeah.
It is wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have to move on. But finally this week, there was a brewing controversy when President Obama, while exiting Marine One, saluted the Marines on the tarmac with his coffee cup in his hand. The incident is now being referred to as the latte salute. So, Don Owens, was the president being disrespectful to the Marines, or are his critics being over-caffeinated?
The president's not being disrespectful. There's so many things here. I'm going to say two things. I'm embarrassed to be discussing this in any kind of television or video forum. This is beyond tempest in a teapot. It's not a salute in a teapot. This is a ridiculous assertion that I believe at the grand level Republicans are just keeping in the news because it ups their base for the elections. And it looks like they might do well in the election, so they don't need something this petty.
They will win the Senate.
No, they don't. No, they won't.
Yes.
No, they won't. That's next show. Anyway, the United States president is not empowered by the military. He shouldn't be saluting the military. The president is empowered by the American people. The tradition of the president exiting Marine One and saluting the Marines started in 1981 when an image consultant told Ronald Reagan that he'd look better if when exiting the helicopter he saluted the Marines. When you look back at the things Republicans have stoked fires over and gotten outraged. First there was the tan suit at a press conference. Then 4 years ago it was the president had his feet up on the desk. Then it was this president uses teleprompters. Why can't he memorize his speeches? George Bush used teleprompters. Ronald Reagan couldn't have gotten through a speech without a teleprompter. Gerald Ford had a picture in the Oval Office with his feet on the desk. How many presidents have worn tan suits? And this week a picture came out of George Bush exiting Marine One
With a dog.
from 2007 with his dog in his hand, making a face and giving a salute.
Yeah.
This is not disrespect, and I would argue that the citizen-elected president of the United States should not be saluting military members because he's not a member of the military.
The dogs.
What about this side? A tempest in a coffee pot?
I mean, look, here's what I'll say about this. I agree that this is completely a silly controversy. I don't see what the point is. And look, let's not confuse the Republican Party with Fox News. They're not the same contra Anita Dunn. The fact remains, however, that Don is correct. The president is empowered by civilians. However, he's also the commander-in-chief of the United States military. And it is part of military code that apparently holding something in your hand makes it a disrespectful salute. I don't think the president meant any disrespect. I think that it's probably my biggest question throughout this whole mess was, why didn't you just put it in the other hand? That was my biggest question.
Flip hands.
It,
Right.
it didn't seem like, but honestly,
Flip hands.
he's right. I mean, Bush held his dog. There have been other cases of presidents doing this sort of thing, and it's true. This tradition did start with Ronald Reagan, and President Obama wanting to imitate Ronald Reagan is not a new thing, either with respect to the tan suit or with respect to this salute. So, look, I don't care. I don't think this matters. I'm sorry that we have to be discussing President Obama holding up a coffee cup as if it's a major news issue, but I will just say that those who are in the military who are offended by this, I can understand why they are, but I think that it's pretty clear that the president wouldn't have meant any disrespect by this action.
Marcio.
I totally agree with you. The president didn't mean any disrespect, and we cannot mix Republican Party and Fox News.
Okay.
I mean, they're totally different things, and there are some members of the Republican Party that could agree with that, but I mean, it's silly to bring that up in such a controversial time. Everything we're living in, ISIS, I mean, the UN this week. There are so many much more important things to discuss.
I disagree with all of y'all. I think it was wrong for President Obama to do this coffee latte cup thing, whatever he was doing. Even though, if memory serves me correctly, Dwight Eisenhower did not salute. And Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was what? A general, you know? And so he had a military background, and he didn't do it. But still.
It's because they didn't have Starbucks then. You think so?
Hey, maybe so, you know? Maybe so. But anyway, President Obama, you know, should have. I mean, furthermore, hey, who was walking behind him? Remember?
His wife.
Exactly. Hey, just give the cup to her. Then salute the military guys. You know, that's you know. If you want, if you can't do the hand changing thing, hand the cup to her, you know, and then salute. I personally thought it was messed up that President Obama did not salute and is walking around with coffee. He can't do what he's supposed to do. And for one thing, especially now, the timing of it. You know, why? Because of the war with ISIS. You know, and all of that.
Does that weaken us?
It doesn't weaken it. A lot of things are, going back to what I said before with Eric Holder, perception. That's the key word, the P word, perception. The dude should have saluted the military guys at the helicopter.
So now we know why we failed in the war in
Yeah.
Iraq. Bush carried the dog off the plane.
Yeah.
Let me offer this as a to go off of what Gregory said. Maybe, and this may be an argument advanced by some people. It's not so much the fact that Obama did this salute; it's the fact that it fits a narrative. You know, for many years, there's been a narrative that Obama does not respect the military. He doesn't listen to his generals.
Right.
He doesn't
Exactly.
respect the military culture.
Exactly.
And this feeds the narrative.
It feeds it big time.
So-
Big time. So many people say that you know, he's anti-military. Because remember, didn't he advise all those cutbacks in the military? It's going back.
Not at all.
You
Not
know,
at all.
You know, and he's been called a reluctant warrior and all that. You know, and not saluting. You know, I agree with Mr. Kidd. Feeds into that narrative of he deep down really doesn't respect the military.
Well, even if he didn't mean any disrespect by the salute, it fits the narrative.
It fits the narrative,
and it gives
right.
people reason to
to go after him.
Do you think if the presidential election was this year,
You know,
anyone who
it's
was
about perception.
Okay, but
that's what I keep saying, especially
perception's
the
got to relate to a
timing.
political outcome,
It-
though.
it's
You're saying
also
you'd lose votes.
It's
or
also
what?
about timing too. The war with ISIS and all this.
We're not at
It's
war
a
with
timing-
ISIS.
It's a war.
Yeah, we are.
I'm sorry, it's a war.
Okay,
You can call it
we're
whatever
talking about a
you want.
president. The president's policies.
It's
We're not
a
at war
war.
with policy.
Yeah.
Let's not talk over each other.
I thought I was going to be the one screaming at him. Look, this
Oh, you know, you should see Greg
This will
and I
end
together.
up. This will end up in someone's convention speech in 2016. I guarantee you. That's as far as it's ever going to go. All I'm going to say is, if this is going to get turned into this gigantic metaphor, thank the Lord it didn't spill, because then you'd have all the hot water metaphors being put up in headlines.
Hot water gate.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. Well, I think one thing we can all agree on: he will never do it again. Right?
You probably right about that.
It was unfortunate.
Okay. Well, let's take some questions from our viewers. First one is from Shannon McCoy, who asks, if the U.S. were not involved at all in the Middle East, would the Islamic State have reason to hate us? Anyone want to take that?
Yes, they would, because they criticize the way we live in the West. Probably it wouldn't grow as we see today the situation, but one of the main reasons for them to exist and to create a caliphate is to look towards the West and do not agree by the way we live and our standards, and they do not appreciate it, and they want to spread their way of the way they live around the world. So they would hate America because America, it's characterizes the way we live in the West. That's how I see it.
In most
And I agree with you partially, and but
Not
I also
me, the questioner.
yes, I agree with what he said in response to the questioner. But I would also caution people from characterizing any Muslims, Sunni or Shia, as disagreeing with our way of life. ISIS, Al Qaeda, offshoots of all those groups have told us, and I'm calling on a quote from Ron Paul here that I can't believe that, they don't hate us because of our way of life. They hate us because we have troops in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia. They hate us because we have troops in the Middle East. And but I do think the basic answer to the question is that they would be at war with the United States, because by attacking and calling out the United States is pretty much the only way they can attract members to their cause. You have to remember, you're not dealing on a mass level with men, and in some case women, who have incredible levels of education. They're recruiting Muslims who often come from very low income, poor, poverty-stricken backgrounds. They're offering them a way of life, in ISIS's case $400 a month, and something to fight for. And the biggest piñata on the wall is America, and that's how they attract recruits.
Let me just say one thing. I was referring to ISIS and not Muslims in general.
Okay.
About just the ISIS and their strategy of creating a caliphate.
Okay, but this is it.
I mean,
So-
look, I know for a fact that there are variations in Islam, but let's talk about the brand of Islam that ISIS subscribes to specifically. There is, in fact, one specific one, and that is the Salafist brand of Islam, which is, in fact, the most far right, so to speak, although I hate to use that word. The most retrogressive, reactionary form
Radical.
of Islam that you can imagine. They would hate us for a number of reasons. They would hate us because we don't stone Jews to death. They would hate us because we don't circumcise our women. They would hate us because we allow free speech. They would hate us because we allow people to criticize religious figures of any kind, theirs especially. They would hate most of the components of the small L classical liberal tradition that exists in the United States. And I think it says a lot that when you look at, say, Iran's list of enemies, Britain is number one. Even if the United States had never intervened in the Middle East, the West, collectively, has intervened in the Middle East. You have to assume a massive counterfactual, which is that the entire West, collectively, i.e. most of Europe and the United States, has no involvement in the Middle East in order for them to not hate us. They would come after the West, and the United States is the biggest symbol of the West. It is the biggest piñata.
I totally agree with you. It makes sense.
Okay. Another question from Bruce Hall, who asks, if we need other nations' boots on the ground in Iraq and Syria, wouldn't it have been better to wait until those other nations stepped up before we got involved?
That goes back to what he was saying.
Yeah, I will jump in with that. And I can only speculate here on what the administration was thinking. But let's not also, we haven't talked about it, but let's not also deny the role of that traditional golden, what's the word I'm looking for? Golden asset that America also keeps its eye on, and that's oil supply. And I think ISIS had begun to upset the oil acquisition. And that's how they're paying much of their fighters. They've been stealing, upsetting oil markets, and getting about $2 million a month. And that plays a role, and we certainly, America cares about oil prices. I'm not one of those people who say that we shouldn't, but I think that's another reason why we're there.
Okay. Anybody else?
If it wasn't us, it would be Putin who got in. They were angering him too much. So one of the
Really?
two
You
was
think
going to
so?
get involved. Oh yeah, Putin at some point would either get through proxies like Iran, or he would push his own money or his own troops into it. I mean,
And help Assad.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
he was already helping Assad. This is not a stretch. We're just getting in on the party.
Okay. All right. And now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. Who would like to start?
Well, I can start. Before coming to the States, I lived in Europe for a while, working in elections. And for one of the places I worked was in France. And I worked for President Sarkozy, bid for the presidency in 2007. And he won. And after he lost re-election, and this week he presented himself to run the UMP. And this is the first step for him to go back and run for president again in the next election. So I think we should keep an eye on that, because Sarkozy was a good ally of the United States, was a good ally of the West, and he knows how to be a good leader of the West. And we live in a time of very weak leaders around the world, and we need strong leaders that have leadership. We don't have leaders with leadership, and Sarkozy could be one of these names in the next presidential election in France.
Gregory, how about you?
I would say Joe Biden. This is the week of the annual Congressional Black Caucus Convention going on at the Convention Center in Washington. And Joe Biden just so happened to attend unannounced at the Fine Arts Award show. And in fact, he opened the show. Why? So he could give his campaign stump speech. You know, I guess he's getting ready for 2016. And, you know, just buffalo your way in. And, you know, I'll begin the show and I'll give a speech and I'll just leave after my speech. And y'all can just go on, just continue with the show. Y'all can go on and honor Felicia Rashad and Dr. Alvin Poussaint. And although he called Felicia Rashad Priscilla, but I'll leave that alone for now. And Bill Withers, you know, who was being honored. But anyway, you know, it's obvious that, you know, he's doing his campaign thing, getting ready, for 2 years, and also trying to make, I guess, having some kind of effect on the midterm elections too. And since it's the Congressional Black Caucus, that of course means that most of the folk in the audience were black folks such as myself, and he harped on the income inequality gap, rich versus poor. It was a whole speech about classism, and wealthy against the poor, and regular people aren't getting raises, and corporate America is taking most of its profits and buying back stock and making sure that the shareholders have serious dividends and all this, whereas the regular person is basically getting nothing except for essentially a 14-cent raise after all these years. Those are the numbers that he used. And he knows that if you talk about income equality, it definitely is going to rile up black folk, and the whole idea, of course, is to keep black folk on the side of the Democrats.
Don Owens, what is the most underreported story of the week?
I believe the most underreported story of the week happens on today, a very important anniversary. On today, in 1957, the 101st Airborne, the U.S. Army, escorted the Little Rock Nine into Little Rock High School, desegregating it, setting in the course of history and an incredible moment for the United States and for white communities, black communities, and generations and communities to come. Desegregating schools not only in Little Rock but also in North Carolina and Louisiana and Texas. And it's really set a precedent, letting Americans know, as we see later in both culture and sports and our larger communities, that we achieve more when we achieve together. And so I think with all that's going on in the world, that story is going to get scant mention on the evening news, but it's very important moment in the country's history.
Okay. Finally, Mytheos.
Yeah, so this week there was a court decision that came down that said the International Trade Commission was wrong in applying its usual standards for imported goods to digital goods. In non-wonk speak, let me explain this. So normally the International Trade Commission only deals with physical shipments of goods, like, if someone imports a lot of iPods or phones or what have you into this country, that's something they usually deal with. But now they're saying that any download that originates in the United States and goes somewhere else, or that originates someplace else and comes to the United States, can be treated as if it's an import, and therefore the person who's importing it can be dragged before the ITC. This could mean a real problem if, for instance, Google puts your Gmail account on a server in Russia, then all of a sudden Google's importing your Gmail account into America. And Google can get dragged before the ITC potentially if there's worry about, for instance, patent infringement or copyright infringement. This means that Apple could potentially be on the hook for any of these things if something gets downloaded incorrectly or the rest of it. The only people who are supporting this kind of treatment of digital goods by a conventional goods-based organization are people, unsurprisingly, like the Motion Picture Association of America and other actors who want to see the internet die because it's damaging their ability to control the flow of information. The court struck it down by pointing out all of the absurd consequences that it could lead to, and hopefully this will probably get appealed, but hopefully that will persist as the case, so that if Google puts your Gmail in Russia on a server or in any other country on a server, you're not going to be on the hook for importing whatever it is you download through your Gmail account.
Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Well, thanks for watching The Square Circle, and we'll see you next week.